Welcome everyone to another Reuters Newsmaker. I'm Axel Threlfall, editor-at-large at Reuters. I am delighted to welcome Shadow Chancellor Anneliese Dodds, who joins us, of course, just a couple of days before the Chancellor spells out his own spending plans. I don't think anyone is expecting anything other than some pretty hefty numbers to be thrown around on Wednesday. Expectations for borrowing this year, roughly £400 billion. That's some 20% of GDP, the heaviest public borrowing since World War II. Now, the Chancellor gave very little away over the weekend, except to say there'll be no return to austerity and a significant increase in funding for public services. So how does Labour think Rishi Sunak is faring, and what would Anneliese Dodds be outlining Wednesday were she in government? Let me hand over to the Shadow Chancellor now, who'll speak for about 10 minutes or so, after which we'll have about 35-40 minutes for questions and answers. Any questions you have, do send them in. There is a strap up on the screen here, slido.com/Dodds Newsmaker. Anneliese, let me give the floor to you.
Well, thanks ever so much, Axel, and it's really good to be with everybody today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Now, I want to start off my speech really by referring to what we heard about this very morning. The Oxford vaccine team are based in my own constituency. Last week, I visited that amazing team who are, of course, developing a vaccine for COVID-19. And as news emerges of increasing successes from clinical trials, we can finally sense some hope. But we're not out of the woods. Infections are still high and the economy is still 10% smaller today than it was at the end of last year. The UK has the highest excess death rate in Europe and is suffering the worst downturn in the G7. That's a double tragedy for the British people. Just as our scientists have worked every hour of the day so we can escape this health crisis, the government must do all it can to lay the foundations for our economic recovery. Wednesday's spending review should be the moment to make responsible choices that will support our frontline workers, ensure we have resilient public services, and invest in a better, more secure future right across the UK. We've seen over the last 8 months who our key workers really are. The social carers who look after the elderly and vulnerable, the staff in our NHS, not just nurses and doctors, but hospital porters and others who make our health service what it is, and who day after day, night after night, have put patients first and themselves last. The teachers and teaching assistants who've taught key workers' children while they help to keep us all safe. And the delivery drivers and retail workers who've kept our economy going through lockdown. But these workers, so critical during this time of need, have often had to survive on a shoestring. 7 in 10 care workers earn less than £10 an hour. So do many of our hospital porters. Many key workers in the private sector are barely keeping their heads above water. And yet, unbelievably, it looks like the Chancellor is set to freeze the pay of those working on the COVID front line. And key workers right across the country are still waiting to hear if they'll get the £10 an hour minimum wage they deserve. Freezing the pay of firefighters, hospital porters and teaching assistants will make them worried about making ends meet ahead of Christmas. That means they'll cut back on spending and our economy won't recover as quickly. Our high streets and small businesses would suffer. That would mean yet more job losses when we've already seen a record number of redundancies, thanks to the Chancellor's constant chopping and changing. Penny pinching for those on the front line, but profligacy when it comes to doling out billions of pounds to a select group of contractors. A National Audit Office report published last week found that suppliers with political connections are 10 times more likely to have won work from this Conservative government. The Conservatives paid £2,000 a day to a former executive of the collapsed outsourcer Interserve, and they paid £7,000 a day to consultants building a test and trace system that still isn't functioning properly. That's £1,000 an hour, more than 100 times the hourly wage of the average care worker. 2 months ago, I warned of this government's file of failure when it comes to waste and mismanagement of public money. Incredibly, since then, yet more has come to light. Over £2/3 billion on NHS coveralls that were never used, including a contract to a firm run by a Conservative councillor. A £500 million pilot testing programme in Salford that was supposed to test all of its 250,000 residents, but was paused when they couldn't even manage 250. And record redundancies caused by the Chancellor waiting until the very last minute to announce changes to wage support, by which point many had already lost their jobs. The British people shouldn't have to pay the price for a government that doesn't know the value of public money, splurging it on outsourced contracts to Tory-linked firms that don't deliver. And they shouldn't have to pay for a Chancellor who's had to come back week in, week out to change his plans, who blocked a circuit breaker, leading to a longer, more painful lockdown, and who still hasn't acted to fix Britain's broken safety net, leaving millions excluded from support, including huge numbers of the self-employed. The Chancellor's irresponsible choices and unacceptable delays are damaging the economy. That's why we're in the grip of a jobs crisis, and it's got Rishi Sunak's name all over it. The British people deserve a responsible approach from their Chancellor, a Chancellor who will use public money wisely to support resilient public services, who will treat our frontline workers decently rather than grinding them down, who will protect delivery drivers and shop assistants from poverty pay instead of throwing them into it. A Chancellor who acts responsibly so our families and communities can have a more secure future. We went into this crisis as one of the most unequal countries in Europe. The pandemic has only made that worse. People living in the north of England have experienced a larger fall in their mental well-being than people in the rest of the country. They've been more likely to have their working hours reduced or to have lost their jobs altogether. They have, bluntly and tragically, been more likely to die of COVID-19. This government claims it has the answers to regional inequality, but the Conservatives have simply not delivered, and regional inequalities have deepened. On Wednesday, they'll make a lot of noise about levelling up the country with another set of pledges on infrastructure. But when it comes to infrastructure, from Boris Island to the Boris Bridge, the Prime Minister's record on delivering on his promises is one of utter failure. And those failures don't start and end with the Prime Minister. 10 years of Conservative failures have seen billions wasted on pet projects and white elephants instead of action to make a difference to people's lives. People in the West Midlands are still waiting for the Midland Metropolitan University Hospital, which should have been open for 2 years by now. Instead, it'll be 4 years late and cost twice what it should have done, with taxpayers footing a bill of £700 million. Northern Powerhouse Rail, 6 years on from first being announced, still hasn't even been approved, let alone started. And right now, victims of domestic violence right across the country are being forced to wait for months to see their abusers brought to justice. The government's £1.2 billion courts modernisation programme has completely failed. It's now running 3 years behind schedule and is costing £172 million a year more than the original plans. And even when projects have got off the ground, the Conservatives never ensure that the spending really makes the difference that it should, employing and upskilling local people and improving the local environment and people's quality of life. That is a collective Conservative failure. After a decade of letting Britain down, people don't want to hear more empty rhetoric and last-minute decision-making from this government. They need urgent action on Wednesday to make this country the best place to grow up in and the best place to grow old in. That means opportunities on people's doorsteps, not at the other end of the country. Young people shouldn't feel that they have to get out to get on. We need high-quality businesses in every town, providing well-paid and secure jobs so people don't just survive but thrive. Government has a clear responsibility, rewarding businesses that do the right thing and not handing public money to those that don't. And where government invests public money, it should commit to using local supply chains and providing opportunities for people who live locally. It also means every part of our country feeling like a good place to set up home. We need genuinely affordable homes, built to last and not expensive to heat. Local authorities should be able to ensure our green spaces are high quality and safe, and our high streets are places people want to visit. Every local area deserves decent services we can all be proud of. Children's centres, schools, leisure centres, youth clubs, post offices and libraries. Instead, we've had years of decline under Conservative governments, with local authorities cut to the bone and many being forced to shed even more staff this year, despite the jobs crisis. The spirit of solidarity and mutual aid we've seen so much of throughout this crisis, from Aberdeen to Aberystwyth, from Cornwall to Caithness, from Blackburn to Brighton, should be supported, not forgotten. People right across our country should feel safe and secure where they live, settled and part of a community, not insecure and just about clinging on. Labour would make responsible choices to protect our key workers, secure the economy and recover jobs in every part of the country. We would recover jobs by bringing forward £30 billion in capital spending over the next 18 months and investing it in the clean industries of the future right across the UK. We'd take action now to build it in Britain again, match the green ambitions of other countries and deliver a clean, jobs-rich recovery. And the Chancellor needs to learn from the damage he caused with his last-minute changes to wage support. Rather than threatening yet more change just after Christmas, he needs to provide certainty for employers that they'll be able to keep their staff on. We need to retrain workers as well with an emergency programme, providing help right now, not waiting until April, when the government's main plans for older workers are due to start, by which point many will have been looking for work for over a year. And rooted in local communities, building on successes like Greater Manchester's Working Well scheme, not outsourced through giant contracts. And we need to rebuild business, with government providing clarity, not confusion, on how we'll emerge from lockdown, including what support will be available under different tiers. Still today, businesses in areas like Liverpool and Middlesbrough simply do not know what support they'll receive if they go back into Tier 3. That's additional unnecessary uncertainty when so many firms feel like they are already only just clinging on. And we need Labour's proposed National Investment Bank to bring us in line with other countries and maximise public and private sector finance to fuel the recovery. On Wednesday, the Chancellor has the chance to take the right, responsible choices for our country. To use public money wisely in support of those at the front line, so we can be resilient against disease and resilient against economic decline. And to face up to regional inequalities with action, not just rhetoric, for a more secure future right across our country in every region and community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anneliese. What I'm going to do, I'm going to kick us off with some with a conversation now for 20 minutes or so, and then I'll bring in our audience questions or insert those as we go along. Look, we've got lots and lots to talk about here. I'm interested to hear how difficult it must be to find the right tone at the moment for you. How tough it must be to come down hard on a government that, let's face it, is spending so much to save livelihoods and to save businesses. Was it harder than normal to get the balance right in this speech?
Well, I have to say, Axel, at this time of national crisis, the most important thing for any opposition party is to be ensuring that we manage to climb out of it, that we act as a constructive opposition to government. And actually, what we've seen, unfortunately, over the last few months, yes, is an unprecedented rise in public spending. But as I've just been setting out, we've seen far too many cases where really quite eye-watering sums of public money have been used not to deliver the kind of support and services that are necessary, but they've been mismanaged, they've been poorly targeted, they haven't resulted in the outcomes required. And we've seen a response that's been far too last minute. You know, we saw this time and time again with wage support, where the Chancellor was really forced into a particular position at the 11th hour, rather than having a longer term plan. We don't want to see a repeat of those problems. You know, we're just about to be having an announcement from the Prime Minister later this afternoon around a new tiered system. We need to learn from what hasn't worked before and make sure we don't have that kind of last minute response, make sure that public spending is effectively targeted.
You know, it sounded quite often in that speech, Anneliese, like quite a personal attack on the Chancellor and the way he does things. You know, too slow, not proactive enough. Is he focused too much on his brand and his profile rather than getting things right, would you say?
Well, I don't engage in personal attacks. I'm concerned if it came across in that manner. Actually, what I'm concerned about is us having the right policies in place so that we can have as strong a recovery as possible. And of course, the UK, worryingly, is an outlier. We have experienced the worst economic downturn in the G7. We've also been an outlier, unfortunately, when it comes to the public health situation, as I referred to. I mean, I think the statistics, the grim statistics, speak for themselves in that regard. Now, we really need to ensure that we have the right policies going forward. You know, I have to be honest, I have been frustrated that we don't seem to have learned those lessons throughout this crisis, particularly about the need for a longer term perspective, about the need for a much stronger grip on whether many of those contracts are delivering, and a lack of acknowledgement of the impact of the public health situation on the economy as well. You know, our test, trace and isolate system in the UK, you know, for months and months, Labour has been warning that it's not being delivered effectively. This period of lockdown should have been used to fix that. It doesn't appear to have been. These long-running problems have continued, and yes, that is a frustration.
Let's talk a little bit about the economics. How important is the deficit at this point of the cycle? Does it matter?
Well, it does matter, because while we may be currently in a situation where there are low interest rates, of course, that may not continue forever. We don't know what kind of economic circumstances are likely to be facing the country in the medium to long term. However, we also know that we are in the grip of that very, very major downturn right now. And just about every expert that you talk to, you know, whether they're from the IMF or some of the comments coming from the IFS over the weekend, they've said very clearly that now would not be the time to be, you know, slamming the brakes on, putting the car in reverse, threatening economic confidence. Now is the time to try and make sure that we're building that economic capacity back up again. In that way, more jobs will be protected, and hopefully we'll see fewer firms going to the wall than we've seen over recent months.
But what is an acceptable deficit level? You know, give us a number, a percentage of GDP. I think we're at about 10% right now. What to you, for the time being, is an acceptable level, and how quickly does that need to come down?
Well, of course, actually, it depends on the circumstances. I don't think it's possible at all to say in absolute terms what an acceptable level would be, because it all depends on what the interest rate context is, what the strength of the economy is. And really, the critical thing right now, as I said before, is to ensure that we have that economic capacity being built back up again, that we don't see more jobs being lost, more businesses going to the wall, more reductions in consumer confidence and investor confidence. Really, we've got to stem that negative tide. That means government having a longer term perspective, not seeking to put the brakes on right now, just as we're climbing through into that recovery.
But okay, let me ask you this on the overall debt. How much debt is too much debt for the British economy, would you say? And I know that also depends on where we are, but generally speaking, what would you say?
Yeah, I think, Axel, with respect, you won't get an economist giving an absolute number either. They would say that it's dependent on the context. You know, I think it's really important that into the longer term, we actually deal with some of those long-term restrictions on productivity, which have meant that it's been harder for us to get up to a stronger level of economic activity. I mean, of course, the debt increased substantially under Conservative governments up to this time. I don't want us to be in that kind of situation into the future, in the medium to long term. I do want us to be in a sensible fiscal position. And as I said, there's always that risk that interest rates could increase into the future. Really, the critical thing is to get that economic activity built up again now, though. That's what's most important. That's what the vast majority of experts are calling for.
But when it comes to a little bit of fiscal restraint, how does the government ultimately rein in that deficit if it's not with the sort of tax rises and public sector wage caps that Sunak is talking about?
Well, the first thing it's got to do is get a grip on the spending that it's engaged in right now. I mentioned in my speech a number of cases where there's been really poor financial management. And we're not talking about small amounts of public money here. £12 billion has been spent on test and trace, and it is still not working in the UK effectively. We know that if that overall system had actually been delivered by local public health services, it would have been more effective. We know that from the Welsh case, where it has been delivered through those services, it has been more effective. It actually probably wouldn't have been as expensive. So that's the first thing that government has got to do in the near term, get a much, much stronger handle on its existing spending, particularly that related to the COVID crisis. But then secondly, it needs to make sure that it's building that economic activity up. What we've got right now are people losing their jobs, businesses going to the wall, people cutting back on spending, investors not investing. When all of that happens, there's less to tax in the first place, because very obviously what would be taxed is reducing. Now, we've got to get out of that situation. We need to make sure that we build that economic activity back up. As I said, that's what the vast majority of expert commentators are calling for. I think the IMF particularly clearly saying now is the time to build back up that economic capacity.
The Chancellor, I think it was yesterday, he said he's not going to pursue austerity. One, do you believe him? And two, if that is indeed the case, he's many would say putting off this problem for the next government to deal with, which could, of course, ultimately, Anneliese, become your problem, right?
Well, to be honest, I think, say, a hospital porter listening to what the Chancellor was saying would really feel that this is just a continuation of previous Conservative policies around cuts to public services. We know what the impact of previous pay freezes have been since 2010 on our public services. We've had huge levels of vacancies in UK public services, unfortunately. That meant we were really lacking in resilience when we entered this crisis. You think about social care, for example, there are about 120,000 vacancies in social care, even before the COVID crisis started. So actually having this kind of approach, saying that there should be a reduction in the spending power for those groups of workers, and that's what this would amount to, is going to be very bad for our public services, but also be very bad for our economies as well, particularly local economies. These are the kind of people who do go and use local high streets, they use small businesses. If they're concerned about their spending power, they're not going to be going out to do that to the same extent.
All right, look, I've got quite a few questions coming in already, and I want to just encourage you all to send them through slido.com/Dodds Newsmaker, and I will come to those in just a second. But let me ask you this. You talk about a moment to make responsible choices. I don't really know how else to put this, but is a Labour Party racked by infighting and desperately trying to rebrand, especially on the economy, the responsible choice? Is that really how you think voters are going to see this?
Well, I think it's absolutely essential that we do have those responsible choices being taken by government and indeed by Labour as the opposition. And actually consistently through this crisis, Labour sought to ensure that we work with government where possible. We haven't sought to try and garner any kind of short-term political advantage or something like that. We are in the middle of a national crisis. We've said to government we will work with them. We want, for example, different systems of restrictions to work when they've been put into place by government. We want our country to climb out of this very, very steep economic downturn. As I said, the worst downturn in the G7. We want our country to get to a better place. I think that's what the British public want as well. They want politicians to be grown-ups at this time, to be working together to try and get us out of this situation.
But it is about rebuilding trust and regaining trust. Do you admit that right now, there is much that is detrimental to you doing that. It must make your job harder, the infighting, this idea, this push to rebuild the brand.
Well, look, Labour has lost a number of general elections. We have to change. We know that. We know that we need to rebuild trust with the public, especially around economic issues, but in relation to a number of other areas as well. I think we've been very open about that, and certainly I've been keen since I've been in post to make sure that I talk directly to people right across the country. Quite a bit of it, I'm afraid, has had to be over the internet, like we're talking now, Axel, because we're not able to move around, clearly because of restrictions, but really talking directly to people, understanding why they might have turned away from Labour before, what is necessary for them to look at Labour again. And actually lots of people are looking at the Labour Party again, but we've got to earn that trust and do it over the next 4 years before that next general election.
And how, just as part of that, how are you, Anneliese Dodds, trying to differentiate yourself from your predecessor?
Well, I have to say what I'm focused on, as I talked before, and I'm sorry if I sound like a stuck record here, I think at the top of all of our minds really is that national interest of getting our country out of this crisis. That's far more important than any kind of internal party issues, anything about the party in inverted commas brand. We want the UK to be out of this crisis. We want people to be protected from COVID. We want that vaccine rollout to be as effective as it possibly can be. And we want our economy back growing in every part of the country. That's what my focus is on, rather than anything connected with brand or something like that. Far more important that we get our country to a better place.
Yeah, okay, and speaking of that, I'm going to jump around a little bit now, but what about Brexit? How worried are you by this, even if there is a skinny trade deal agreed? How damaging will this be if and when it's realised?
Well, of course, we don't have that deal in front of us yet. We would be in an even more difficult situation if there was a no deal outcome. Clearly, we're all hoping that there will be a deal, but as you said, I mean, your phrase was skinny. I've sometimes felt it's likely to be as thin as gruel. It's going to be a very, very thin deal from all of the whispers that we've heard so far. And clearly that will have a significant impact. And really, I would kind of return us to what the Conservatives promised previously. They said they would get that deal that would preserve jobs in the UK, that would really be supporting businesses in the UK. Initial signs really aren't very positive in that direction. So we're holding them to their promises, because we need to make sure, particularly at this time when our economy is under so much stress from coronavirus, that the government really delivers on that deal that they promised when it comes to Brexit.
Sector specific now, financial services, you've made noises you want to work with this sector. I think the phrase you used is provide them with a stable operating environment. Where's that conversation going now? And a question comes in here from a viewer. Brexit may result in financial services moving to EU financial centres. Any thoughts on what action we need to put in place to avoid that?
Well, I think unfortunately we've already seen some transfer of business away from the UK. About £1.2 trillion worth of assets, I believe, have now left the UK. Over 7,000 jobs by one of the latest pieces of research. We've already seen an impact actually from I would argue, from the approach to negotiations of the UK government. I mean, I remember the days, and I've been involved with financial and related professional services for a long time, both personally, because my father was a small businessman, he was an accountant, but then also when I've been a politician, because I worked on financial regulation for quite a long time in Europe. And actually, I remember what we've seen over the last few years. Initially, we were promised by the Conservatives that there would be a passporting regime that would make it really easy for UK firms to operate in Europe. Then that was downgraded to what they called enhanced equivalence. Now we don't even have those equivalence deals in place for many, many different forms of financial activity. Sorry, please ignore the bell behind me. I don't have to run off for a vote. So this does concern me very much. I'm well aware that the huge numbers of British people who work in financial services. I think it's 1 in 14 people in the United Kingdom as a whole who actually work in financial related professional services, 2/3 of them outside London as it happens. So this is a sector that's very, very important for our future.
Do you have any sense that rejoining the EU in the future is a possibility, is workable, is desirable?
I mean, I would be very, very surprised if that is a likelihood. I think that certainly that would be the case, both from the UK side, but from the EU side as well. What we really need to do is to ensure that we have that deal in terms of setting up our future trading relationship, which will protect jobs as much as possible, and try and make sure that we have a fair and decent settlement for our businesses so that they can continue to operate as smoothly as possible. That's what the test is for the UK government right now.
Before I come to some more of the questions coming through, I want to circle back to the person you're shadowing, Rishi Sunak. And I guess my question is, someone who is, it's clearly about a profile, it's clearly about a brand here as well to a degree. How does a Shadow Chancellor take on someone like Rishi Sunak, who managed to get, what was it, the TUC and the CVI to pose alongside him outside number 11? That must be a tall order. Or is keeping a low profile, keeping your head down and getting on with the job the way you want to do this?
Well, look, as I said before, Axel, I'm not someone who's focused on personalities and individuals. I want to make sure that we've got the right policies in place, particularly at a time of national crisis. I do think that we've had the wrong approach. Very often we've seen last minute panic decision making that's cost jobs. We've had record redundancies in the last quarter. We haven't seen those decisions, those responsible decisions being taken that would be helping to build back up economic activity, as I detailed in my speech. So there are a number of areas where I think the Chancellor has most definitely gone in the wrong direction, where I don't believe he's been taking responsible choices. But I think actually that's a collective failure of the Conservative Party. I don't think it's just about one person.
What's your job over the next 4 years? What will success look like for you over the next 4 years?
Well, success for me is actually trying to make sure we have those policies put in place so that we can stop this absolute tsunami of unemployment, unfortunately, that's occurring in the UK, so that we can try and keep more people out of debt. Again, record levels in many cases of people falling into debt, so that we can try and stop more firms going bust. That's the immediate challenge, and that's what we're focused on right now. Obviously, then into the future, we need to make sure that as the economy does start to recover, that we deal with those long-term challenges. You know, as I mentioned in my speech, we need to make sure that our country, in every single part of it, is a place where people want to set up their home, that we don't have this situation that's so common across the UK, where young people feel that they've got to get out so that they can get on, where parents are really torn because they want their kids to stay near them, but the jobs just aren't there. We've got to sort that out for the future. And that's got to be linked, of course, with one of the biggest, if not the biggest, economic challenges of our time, which is facing up to that climate crisis and environmental degradation. Far more that government should be doing in that area to have a clean, jobs-rich recovery, and one which would stand us in good stead with the technologies of the future.
I'll come to climate in just a moment, because I do want to explore that a little bit. But on taxes, you've said in the past that the system under Labour would be more progressive. Just tell us a little bit what you mean by that. What taxes need to rise, and by how much would they rise? I know you're not going to tell me specifics here, but give me a little bit that we can work with.
Well, the first thing that I would say around this is that actually right now, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I really think it's imperative for governments not to be focused on taxation, but actually on preserving the tax base. So I would want to make that very, very clear. Into the longer term, we do need to have a more progressive tax system. Some of the latest statistics indicate that actually the very best off 10th of people pay less of their income in tax than the very worst off 10% of people. I think the vast majority would view that as a problem. So we do need to have a more progressive tax system. Now, Labour will be working out the exact details of our tax proposals in the run-up to the next general election. That will be a really broad, wide-ranging discussion, as with all of our policy development, one that will involve business, trade unions, labour members, other stakeholders, to make sure that we come up with a really strong plan, one that can be implemented very, very smoothly, one which will be delivering that greater progressivity, but one which will be, above all, also ensuring that that economic recovery continues.
A question here on cutting your view on cutting the foreign aid budget. You know, I think overall we know your position on this. Update us though. The question goes: would cancelling the debt of poorer countries free up capital for them to invest in this country?
So I think there are two different issues there. In terms of the government's commitment to 0.7%, some of the whispers that we've heard, and as usual, we seem to be hearing whispers rather than anything being directly announced by government. Some of the whispers around this suggesting that there would be a removal of that commitment, obviously going against what the Conservatives promised before, do seem to jar a lot with some of the commitments of the Prime Minister in particular, saying that he wants to have this much more global approach. It seems like the wrong choice in that context. But when it comes to the debt situation, particularly for those much poorer countries, developing countries, I've been working with Lisa Nandy, who's our Shadow Foreign Secretary, on this issue. We found it very frustrating that whereas there has been a strong international push around public debt and towards ensuring that there are mechanisms to restructure public debt, we've not seen the kind of active approach, particularly from the UK government, that we saw after the global financial crisis, in order to pull private debtors into that process as well. And of course, much of that private debt is actually contracted for through London. So we've really been pushing the UK government, saying they need to take a more active approach around this, because yes, it could impact on the UK in terms of investment here. It could also impact on the UK, of course, if it means that there continues to be a public health crisis in many other countries. You know, we are a globe that is interconnected now. If we continue to have coronavirus, for example, still very strong in other countries, that will have an impact on the UK as well.
Yeah, okay. There's a question here on tech and R&D spending. That will help fuel a recovery, but currently restrained by poor cash flow, goes the question. What policies does the Labour Party support to boost business investment in this space?
Well, yes, that's right. We have seen a slowdown in investment. I think there are a variety of different reasons for that. I mean, obviously, the current situation means that many firms are really seeking to constrain their investment. They're trying to keep cash in the firm to deal with potential additional falls in demand and that kind of thing, and disruption to supply chains. So we've said that really government needs to ensure it's boosting confidence here so that firms feel that they can invest with that confidence. First of all, we think that means having much stronger ambitions around some of the core areas for the UK economy into the future, particularly around those technologies of the future, you know, facing up to the climate crisis, which you mentioned we're going to go on to talk about. We would say it's also necessary for government to look at Labour's plans for a national investment bank. Heard some whispers over the weekend that government might be doing that. I really hope they will, because the UK is really a bit of an outlier here now, not having a national investment bank. We used to have a green investment bank, of course, which the Conservatives decided to privatise, so it didn't function in the way that it was envisaged. And then we need to be dealing with the longer term debt that might have been accrued through this crisis that's weighing so heavily on companies, particularly smaller companies. Now, City UK set out some, I think, quite sensible proposals around how government could seek to recapitalise some of those firms so that it could really encourage them to be investing from the middle of next year, when we really need them to be doing that, so they won't be weighed down with that debt anymore. We haven't seen any shift from government yet on that, and I'd really encourage them to engage with City UK again around those proposals.
You know, we are talking about tech and R&D and entrepreneurship generally. Another question asked, is it right for the Chancellor to increase capital gains taxes? Presumably this is going to act as a disincentive to entrepreneurship here in the UK at a time when of course, we need it the most.
Well, of course, we'll look very carefully at any proposals government comes forward around different tax changes. But I have to say, in relation to this case, other suggestions that were made over the summer that we might be seeing changes to, for example, income tax, national insurance, VAT, really now is not the time for government to be proposing major tax changes. Doing that pulls confidence out of the economy. Really what they should be focused on right now is ensuring that economic activity is built back up again. And I think a number of expert commentators have been making the same case. I don't think it's sensible for the Chancellor to be doing that. It seems that perhaps this is partly driven by arguments within the Conservative Party feeling they need to be talking about consolidation now. That's not what many other countries are doing, and I don't think it's what should be happening in the UK either.
All right, let's get to climate. And you mentioned climate earlier on. What do you make of the government's recent pledge on getting to net zero by 2050? It had a bit of a mixed response, and I guess I wonder if you were in power, what you would be doing and how much you would commit to spending on this.
Yeah, so we set out last week part of the results of a major consultation that we did exactly on this subject. So we asked a whole range of stakeholders, businesses, possibly a number of them on this call, but also trade unions, NGOs and so forth, asked them what they felt was necessary in order for us to achieve net zero, but also in order for us to deal with the ecological problems that we're facing as a globe as well. Now, out of that consultation, we received 2,000 responses to that. In particular, on the capital spending side, we came up with a number of recommendations. They're detailed in a report called the Green Economic Recovery, which people can access on the internet if they'd like to have a look at it. I'd be delighted to hear any feedback that people have on it. I mean, our core argument was that really government should be bringing forward spending. Now we suggested £30 billion being brought forward over the next 18 months. We detailed how that kind of front-loaded spending now could support up to 400,000 jobs. It's quite a conservative estimate. It was built up on the basis of evidence from a number of different researchers that are detailed in the reports. We think that kind of commitment is necessary, and sadly what we've seen so far from government has fallen far short of that commitment. Most of what has so far been announced actually was already announced by the Conservatives. We haven't seen a significant additional commitment, and that means that actually we're far behind other countries like France and Germany, which are being far more ambitious in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I believe the numbers, they've so far committed 12 billion of public money. They think another 36 or so billion will materialise via the private sector. How much more would Labour spend? How much more would you commit?
Well, actually, that commitment, as I understand it, I think around £3 billion of that was additional money beyond what had already been committed to. So as I said, this is not a significant increase. As I mentioned, we believe that it's necessary to have that commitment of £30 billion in capital spend over 18 months. Now, quite a lot of that is around bringing forward spending that government's already committed to, because actually the Conservative plans are over a very long period, over 5 years in some cases, but that's in a context where many other measures that would be aiding the green recovery haven't been put into place. I mentioned in my speech, for example, the Northern Rail project. I mean, that's 6 years behind schedule. We've seen commitments around, everything from carbon capture and storage to hydrogen, just not moving forward. I look at a technology like hydrogen, for example, and that could absolutely, it could revitalize whole regions of the UK if it was put in practice at the scale that's occurring in other countries. And yet we have our government talking about a hydrogen village. And there's a complete difference in scale and ambition when we could really be both building up jobs across the country, but also be supporting that transition if we had a much more encompassing vision from government.
Just final on climate. We hear a lot about the opportunity now of climate solutions as part of a recovery. There is money available, there is a pot available, but it won't be available forever, this money. Do you think the government is missing that opportunity?
I do think that it's missing many of those opportunities, unfortunately. And, I talk to a lot of businesses across the UK, as you would anticipate. There are absolutely incredible examples of innovation going on across our country. And yet so often they're not moving forward. I mean, a lot of the time, it's actually because there are regulatory issues as well that government hasn't taken a grip on. I mean, we're still waiting for the government's energy plans to come forward. For example, we've seen huge amounts of chopping and changing on issues like energy efficiency or onshore wind, where if we'd had a more stable regulatory context, that would have actually incentivized the kind of development that we need to see. So it is a big frustration to me, because I don't think as a country we're lacking in that expertise and that drive. And I think that very often the investment is there, but it needs to have a government that will really take a grip of some of these barriers to making sure that it's put into place.
All right. Look, I'm going to jump around a little bit because I want to get to as many of these questions as I can. On levelling up, how would Labour ensure we invest in education around the country, particularly in cold spots? What role do our universities play in this?
Well, I believe that universities play an absolutely critical role, and this is about, as I mentioned before, us ending up with a situation unlike the current one, instead having a situation where people feel that they can stay in the same town, village or city where they grew up, that they don't have to move, that there are educational opportunities, employment opportunities where they live, where if people want to move, of course they can, but where they're not absolutely forced to. Sadly, the situation in the UK at the moment is the latter. So often people feel that they have to move for those opportunities. I think a big part of the solution will be the university sector, and I think they do absolutely incredible work in this area. But I think another part of the solution has got to be around further education and apprenticeships as well. Over the last few years, we've seen some really negative developments there. We've seen about a third of the funding of the further education sector being pulled away. We've seen the number of young apprentices reducing, and particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds going down in number at the very time when we need them to be going up. So I think there's a lot more that can be done to ensure everyone gets that decent chance in life.
We saw some services sector numbers today. The PMIs, clearly that sector is struggling. Another question comes through: what should be done now to ensure there's a hospitality industry left post-COVID? Support now versus rebuilding later, I guess is the question.
Well, I think it's a really critical question. And now that we know, thanks to the work of incredible scientists and innovators across the country, including the UK, now that we know we have that vaccine, which will be available, obviously we need to make sure that it's delivered effectively, but we can see that light at the end of the tunnel. And that means that government's got to focus on really supporting those businesses that will be part of the process of pulling us into an economic recovery once we come out of this public health crisis. Yeah. And I think the situation for hospitality has been incredibly difficult. I mean, I talked to, or learned from rather, they contacted me with details of their situation. One particular restaurant, they said before the last lockdown that we had, they didn't know whether they were going to be able to pay their staff the next week 80% of their wages, 67%, 77%, or whether they were going to have to make them redundant, because they had literally no idea what government was going to do next around wage support. We simply cannot have that continuing. Government is going to be announcing apparently a new tiered system today. Yep. Now, we've said to them, they've got to learn from the lessons of what failed before. They need to set out both exactly what those restrictions will be, because they weren't very clear for many of those operating in the hospitality sector, but also what support might be provided alongside them. That needs to be spelled out so that you don't have businesses trying to operate, from one day to the next or 1 week to the next. Businesses cannot do that. Government might think that it can, but it simply doesn't work for a business, particularly small business.
Anneliese, you talk about your hope for the vaccine. Are you worried though? And I ask this because you seem to touch on it. Are you worried that it won't be delivered effectively, that the government might get this wrong?
Well, we've been trying to lay out to government ways in which they can hopefully protect against that eventuality. Again, we think we've got to learn from what went wrong, to put it bluntly, over the last few months, particularly with test, trace and isolate. So what we found there was that actually having very, very large outsourced contracts did not deliver that service effectively. Instead, working with existing institutions that have expertise is the best way to deliver these kinds of services. Now, when it comes to the vaccine, Keir set out, I think it was the beginning of last week, just before we did a visit to the Oxford Vaccine Centre, a number of steps that we want government to take now to make sure that rollout will be as effective as possible. I mean, elements of this, for example, will be making sure that they actually use those institutions which people trust, which people are used to going into, that they're using buildings, for example, locally that people are used to, that they involve the armed forces who are excellent at these kinds of logistical challenges, that they pull people together, actually describe this as a national effort, get everybody involved in it to make sure there's that support. And
But do you believe the government's going to get this right?
Well, to be honest, I think we all have to hope beyond hope that they will, because this is the only way out of these current circumstances. You know, our scientists and all the others who've been involved in developing those vaccines. I mean, I know many of those involved in the Oxford vaccine very well, actually, you know, kind of school mums, my son's school involved with this, who've been working incredibly hard. They've delivered their side of the bargain to a large extent through all of that hard work. Now we need to make sure that the logistics are there so that we can get this delivered to those who really need it, so that we can finally start to climb out of this public health crisis.
And when the vaccine does come through and is distributed as effectively as you hope, how long before we could see pre-pandemic levels of activity in the UK economy, would you say?
I mean, I think that's a very interesting question. And this is where I think we're all really hoping that any changes in people's consumption activity in particular, and any changes to investment practice, that they would have been kind of pandemic specific and that they won't relate to a longer term lack of confidence in the UK economy. We don't think, by the way, that those processes can't be affected by government. They can. There's a lot that government can be doing now to build confidence so that people will feel, coming out of this crisis, that they're in a more secure situation, whether we're talking about household finances or whether we're talking about the finances of a small business that's accrued debt, for example, during this period. A lot that government can do to build up that confidence so we do get back to that stronger level of economic activity.
And look, just a couple final questions. I mean, this is quite a big question, you know, with your economist's hat on, but we have only got a few minutes. Have the data and the stories coming out of this COVID era taught you anything new about how the UK economy works, or any economy for that matter?
I mean, I think there are so many points to this, but I'll try and compress them given that we're running out of time. I have to say this crisis has underlined to me quite how incredible many of our UK businesses are, actually. I mean, we've seen time and time again how businesses, both small and large, have really stepped up to this challenge. I mean, that Oxford vaccine, as we were just talking about, of course, that's joint with AstraZeneca. Now, they've actually committed to ensuring that the vaccine will be provided at cost price in perpetuity for developing countries, that it will be provided at cost price during the pandemic. I think an absolutely incredible example of corporate responsibility, all the way from that kind of scale right down to the businesses, you know, in my home area that, for example, have been making sure that vulnerable people receive hot meals. And that, of course, is linked to the broader development we've seen in society across all of our communities, people pulling together, often in some of the hardest of circumstances, to support each other. And that's been incredibly humbling. I think it's really important that we don't lose track of that, that we remember that, we build on it and make sure that we have those really thriving communities into the future. So that would be at least one thing. There are many, many more, but I think that's one critical element I'd want to highlight. All
right, and look, Anneliese, I want to circle back to the Labour Party and the image of the Labour Party, just to finish this off. I mean, you used the word responsible in your speech. So I guess the question is, you know, how best to rebrand your party as a responsible guardian of the economy after, let's face it, the quite radical approach of John McDonnell?
Well, again, I'm going to sound like a stuck record here. You know, I think in the middle of a national crisis, kind of branding or image of a political party is really not at the top of our minds. We're focused.
No, but I'm talking about just moving. I'm talking about moving the party forward with credibility.
Well, we're in a different set of circumstances now, very, very obviously. You know, Labour has suffered from a number of general election defeats. We've got to face up to that. We've got to be honest about that. We've got to have those honest conversations with the public, understand why people might not have trusted us or they might have turned away from us over recent years, and make sure that we do something about that, that we don't ignore it, instead that we move forward and listen to those people, make sure we're putting policies forward that actually deal with their concerns. That's what I'm interested in doing. And I think all of my colleagues right across the Labour front bench, indeed across the party, are really committed to doing that as well.
All right, I'm going to try it one final way. John McDonnell's whose directory entry, I think, read plans to foment the overthrow of capitalism. What would you want your who's who entry to say?
Oh goodness, well, I would never want to presume that I might be feted in that way. I mean, I certainly would want to be known as someone who understands the situation that so many people are in. As I said, I'm always very well aware of, I suppose, my own upbringing, the fact that, you know, my dad was a small businessman who really worked hard. I recognise that right across the UK. I want our country to be a great place where people can grow up in and grow old in, where they can feel settled in their communities, really feel proud of them. That's what's so important to me. And if I can somehow contribute to us achieving that as a politician, then I'd be delighted. But, you know, I think a lot of that work is actually not going to be undertaken by politicians. It's delivered by, you know, different communities, individuals, trade unions, businesses, our public services. And hopefully politicians can support them in doing that.
All right. Look, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I want to thank you, Anneliese, for your time and your candor. I want to thank all the viewers as well for their questions. Anneliese Dodds, Shadow Chancellor, thank you very much indeed for talking with Reuters today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone on the call.